November is an especially unpleasant month, particularly in London. But November of 1940 was particularly awful for the British Prime Minister. The Secret Service had intercepted a Nazi transmission from Berlin, encrypted with an Enigma-class cipher machine. Upon its eventual decryption, the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was informed that the Germans were planning to launch an air raid and bomb the city of Coventry to ashes in a matter of days. Fortunately, there was still time to evacuate the city. But such a mass exodus would likely alert the enemy to the fact that their radio transmission had been intercepted and deciphered. They would change the signal, employ a new encryption method that might take months to crack. Enemy troop movements, supply line routes, Panzer tank unit deployment, all of this critical strategic intelligence would slip through the hands of the British. The flow of information would stop. And in the end, even more lives might be lost. I can well imagine the dreary November rain splashing against Churchill's window as he ponders his next move. His weary eyes staring into space as the cup of tea on his desk grows cold. And I'm reminded of something that I heard once somewhere, that a nightmare is just a dream where every choice you make is the wrong one. The Second World War involved some particularly difficult choices for those in the seats of power. In any war, leaders have to make the best decisions that they can in light of whatever intelligence happens to be available. And ethical considerations often take a back seat to tactical wisdom. I'm sure that Barack Obama didn't feel especially good about ordering the assassination of Osama bin Laden, even if it was in America's best interests. And I'm sure that President Franklin D. Roosevelt didn't feel especially good about brokering an alliance with Joseph Stalin during World War II, even if it did have its strategic advantages. The truth is, sometimes politicians have to do things that keep them awake at night for the greater good of their people. And this was certainly true of the most morally controversial operation of the Second World War. After the Japanese launched their assault on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt famously said that they had awakened a sleeping giant. And then he proved it. On August 6th of 1945, at 8:45 in the morning, we dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, killing everything within a 1-mile radius, just like a juggernaut, crushing cities beneath its titan weight. Perhaps the atom bomb wasn't the most ethical weapon of choice. It certainly wasn't a fair fight. But then some have said the same thing about David's battle with Goliath. The story always portrays David as the obvious underdog, a gangly, awkward kid who dares to take on a giant of biblical proportions. But there's more to this well-worn tale than meets the eye. According to Jewish folklore, giants were the ancient offspring of lecherous angels and human women. They were superhuman creatures of immense strength, and they were not easily defeated. Rabbinic legend that tells of a different giant, a giant named Og, whom Moses defeated by leaping 10 feet in the air and burying an absurdly large battle axe in his skull. These giants could only be killed by superhuman feats of strength. But lacking such abilities, David relies on, shall we say, some rather unsportsmanlike tactics. Let's examine the facts to determine just which one of them is, in fact, the deadliest warrior. According to the text, Goliath is 6 cubits tall. Now that's about 9 feet. The author takes great pains to detail the giant's entire armory, from his coat of bronze mail to the greaves on his legs, to the precise weight of the point on his massive iron spear, the blade of which weighs about 15 pounds by itself. Given all this, we can assume that Goliath is a large and slow-moving target beneath all of that metal, a well-armored but heavily encumbered tank of a man. Now, David is faced with a difficult choice here. He can do battle on Goliath's terms or on his own. In other words, David can cheat or he can die. He tries to don the king's armor to wield his sword, but he tells the king, "I can't walk in these, for I am not used to them." And it's just as well. Had David tried to fight Goliath in close quarters combat, he would have never survived. So he pulls out a little atom bomb of his own. Buried beneath all of that armor, towering 9 feet above the fray, Goliath is an easy target, a sitting duck. Remember, as the text reminds us, that David grew up as a sheep herder. Hitting Goliath in the face with a rock presented no challenge whatsoever for David, who was accustomed to hurling stones at smaller and faster-moving targets, like wolves and other predators who might try to devour his flock of sheep. When I was in high school, I was confronted once by a rather large bully. He was a good foot taller than I was, and trailing behind him were 2 or 3 of his cronies. I don't remember what he wanted exactly, but what I do remember, oddly enough, is that I had in my possession, for reasons that I won't elaborate on here, a large frozen turkey in a plastic bag. Stepping back, I swung the turkey in an arc above my head, like David brandishing his sling. As I dramatically swooped the rock-solid bird through the circles above my head, the very motion struck terror into the hearts of my enemies, who fled down the hallway in a panic like the cowardly Philistines they were. I guess they had more sense than Goliath, who stupidly stood his ground in the face of certain death. The truth is, Goliath didn't stand a chance. Perhaps David's sling wasn't the most ethical weapon of choice. As the old saying goes, it was like bringing a gun to a knife fight. But David, for all of his cunning, wasn't really the bravest of men. He was a politician at heart, not a soldier. And his reign as king of Israel, like any political career, would be filled with hard choices. Like Churchill, like Roosevelt, like any world leader, David would have to choose between what was morally right and what was politically expedient. And his battle with Goliath set the tone for the rest of his career, a wildly successful reign that was marked by brilliant stratagems and morally questionable decisions. And when he beheads Goliath with his own sword, we catch a glimpse of just how ruthless David would one day become. David was a good king. But was he a good man? And are these mutually exclusive categories? At the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, middle school students are given the opportunity to experience firsthand the sort of hard decisions that politicians have to make. In an elaborate role-playing scenario, that plays out against multi-million-dollar set pieces. Students reenact former President Reagan's 1983 invasion of Grenada. Some take on the role of military commanders, while others are assigned to be war correspondents in the media. And one lucky kid gets to be President Reagan himself, complete with a jar of jelly beans on his Oval Office desk. Unfortunately, the jelly beans are also part of the multi-million-dollar set and are therefore not edible. Through this interactive game, students learn all about the complicated ins and outs of the Grenada incident. Back in '83, the United States had planned an invasion of the Caribbean island after a coup d'etat had ousted the current regime. The invasion was put at risk, however, by media outlets who had reported news of the attack before it had even taken place, compromising our position. And Reagan had to make a tough choice. Either abort the mission or send in the troops, even though the enemy knew they were coming and would be waiting for them. Now, because this educational installation is housed at the Reagan Library, you might say it's just a little bit biased. When the little tyke playing Reagan makes all the same decisions that the president made, a little bell rings, and he's rewarded with the compliments of the staff. But if the youngster goes his own way and does his own thing, calling off the invasion, for instance, a grating buzzer goes off, and the poor kid is treated to a lecture about why he's wrong and why Ronald Reagan is always right. If only the answers to the dilemmas we face were so obvious. A series of bells and buzzers that let us know if we're on the right track. But life is messy, as we all know, and politics doubly so. As we learn from the bombing of Coventry or Hiroshima, or the invasion of Grenada or Iraq, or from the bailout of the world's largest financial institutions, the line between victory and failure, right and wrong, is often completely indecipherable. And leading the free world is hard enough without the complications of backroom handshakes, campaign financing, corporate interests, approval ratings, and partisan congressmen and women who would just as soon punch one another in the throat as say hello in the hallways of Capitol Hill. Really, it's no wonder that Abraham Lincoln quit politics to become a vampire hunter. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more straightforward and satisfying line of work. I was watching a television show last week where the fictional mayor of Seattle was giving a little speech to his successor who had beaten him in a recent election. "I thought I could change things in this office," he said, "but the only thing this office changes is the people in it." Well, okay, it wasn't the pinnacle of brilliant dialogue, but it was a good reminder that at the end of the day, the people in office are people too. Not gods, not giants, just people. And mere human beings simply are not equipped to make the kind of decisions that world leadership demands of them. The kind of choices that shape the fates of millions. None of us was ever meant to wield that kind of influence, a power worthy only of God. In truth, God never wanted a human king. God only anointed Saul, the first king of Israel, because the people demanded a human ruler. But God was opposed to the idea from the very beginning. "They've rejected me," the Lord says sadly in the first book of Samuel, after the people clamor for a human king. "They've rejected me." "Comply with their request," God tells the prophet Samuel, "but let them be warned." At the risk of stating the obvious, this is an election year. And that means it's going to be a politically ugly year. The climate in Washington, as we all know, is fiercely polarized these days, with both Democrats and Republicans quick to judge the other side as inherently wrong about everything. London isn't the only place with unpleasant Novembers. Now, unlike some preachers, I'm not about to use this pulpit to tell you how you should vote. That would be an egregious violation of the separation of church and state. And more importantly, I could lose some of my clergy tax benefits, which I'm not about to give up. And the truth is, I don't really know what kind of leader I'm looking for anyway. In a perfect world, I suppose I'd opt for a wise and benevolent king that can navigate political complexities with ease, who always finds the win-win solution to every problem, whose decisions never cost people their jobs or their lives. Someone like me. But really, this person doesn't exist. And we don't live in a perfect world. So given my druthers, what sort of person would I choose? Do I want someone of high ideals who never compromises her moral vision, no matter the cost to herself or her country? Or if we're being honest, would I really prefer an unscrupulous pragmatist, someone like David, who always gets the job done, no matter what it takes, not for his own sake, but for the greater good? A commander-in-chief who bears the guilt for tough decisions so that I don't have to. The truth is, I just don't know. When the news of Osama bin Laden's death flashed on the television screen, I have to confess that I was somewhat relieved. I was at a bar with some old pals celebrating our best friend's wedding. And rather than tainting the celebratory atmosphere, the news of this man's death at the hands of our government only enhanced it. The head of the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda had been brutally removed, as surely as David had decapitated Goliath. And I'm ashamed to say that I never thought that the news of a man being murdered in his own bedroom could make me feel so good. After billions of dollars spent, thousands of soldiers killed, untold rounds of ammo fired, the man himself had at last been brought down with a single bullet, or more likely a couple of magazines worth, in what was no doubt a bitter explosion of raw emotion. Maybe we should have captured bin Laden and brought him to trial. And maybe it's better that he never left that room alive. I still don't know what to believe. The unfortunate reality of the socio-political, ethical system is that the morally correct decision is not always the choice that is best for the preservation of society. Before Dietrich Bonhoeffer engaged in his infamous plot to kill Adolf Hitler, he wrote that before other men, our deeds might be justified, but before God, we can hope only for grace. Throughout history, kings and generals, presidents and prime ministers have had to make questionable moral choices for the sake of the greater good. And maybe, just maybe, I'm glad that they did, even if it isn't what Jesus would do. But then Jesus never wanted to be president, and neither do I. It's much easier to stand aside and let someone else do the dirty work. Maybe David was a coward for killing Goliath the way he did, but really, who am I to judge when I've been standing on the sidelines with those other Israelites doing nothing at all? Amen.